Summary: a late knock, a quiet request, and a promise that weighed more than I expected. This is the evening that changed how I saw family, trust, and myself. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. The evening my nephew knocked on my door, I was standing at the kitchen sink, watching the last bit of daylight slide off the maple tree in my yard. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in once you've lived alone long enough to notice every creak and hum. I remember thinking it felt like a pause, like the world was holding its breath. The knock wasn't loud, just careful, respectful. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, I knew something was different. He wasn't a boy anymore. He hadn't been for years. Still, seeing him on my porch at that hour stirred something protective and uneasy in me. "Aunt Claire," he said, voice low. "Can I come in for a minute?" I stepped aside without thinking. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of damp leaves. Inside, the house felt warm and safe, lit by a single lamp in the living room. He stood there for a moment, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time, even though he'd been there countless times growing up. We sat across from each other, the small coffee table between us like an unspoken boundary. I offered him tea. He shook his head. His knee bounced, then stilled when he noticed I'd seen it. "I need to talk to you," he said, "and I need you not to tell anyone." That was when the tension settled in. Not sharp or dramatic, just heavy. The kind that presses gently, but doesn't let go. I nodded, feeling the weight of what he was asking before I even knew the details. He talked slowly, choosing his words with care. About feeling lost. About expectations that didn't fit him anymore. About carrying something alone for too long. There was nothing shocking in the facts, but there was bravery in the telling. I listened, really listened, the way I wished someone had listened to me years ago. As he spoke, I noticed small things. The way his voice steadied when he realized I wasn't interrupting. The way the room seemed to shrink, not uncomfortably, but intimately, like a shared shelter from the rest of the world. When he finished, the silence felt different. Softer. He looked at me, eyes searching, and said again, quieter this time, "Please don't tell anyone." I promised. And in that moment, I didn't yet understand how that promise would ask me to grow, too. After he asked me that second time, his voice barely above a whisper, I felt the years between us stretch and then soften. I wasn't just his aunt in that moment. I was another adult who had lived long enough to understand how heavy silence can be. I told him to take a breath. I remember placing my mug back on the table because my hands had started to shake, and I didn't want him to see that. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires hissing on the street, a reminder that the world was still moving even though our little corner felt paused. He leaned back against the couch and finally let his shoulders drop. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, not as an accusation, more like a confession. That sentence stayed with me. It echoed in places I didn't expect. I thought about the times I had stood in my own kitchen years earlier, wishing there had been someone I could knock on without having to explain myself first. I asked him questions, gentle ones, not to pry, but to understand. Each answer came a little easier than the last. He spoke about choices he'd made, about feeling like he'd stepped into a life that belonged to someone else. He wasn't asking for solutions. I could tell. He was asking for space, for understanding. At one point, he laughed quietly at himself, shaking his head. "I didn't plan this," he said. "I just drove." I smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was human. We don't plan the moments that matter most. They find us when we're tired enough to stop pretending. The house felt different as the evening went on. The lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and the clock in the hallway ticked louder than usual. I realized how long it had been since I'd shared a real conversation with someone who wasn't trying to impress or persuade. He asked me if I ever felt like I'd disappointed people. The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. I told him yes. Many times. I told him disappointment wasn't the end of the story, even when it felt like it. There was a shift then. Subtle, but real. A sense of mutual respect settling in. Not teacher and student. Not older and younger. Just two people sitting with the truth for a while. When he finally stood to leave, it was later than either of us realized. He paused at the door, hand on the knob, and looked back at me. "Thank you," he said, "for not making it bigger than it needed to be." After he left, I stood there listening to the quiet again. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something new. A responsibility I had chosen, and a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone is a place to be heard. The days after that evening moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just with a new awareness, like when you notice a clock ticking only after someone points it out. I went back to my routines, grocery lists, morning coffee, evening walks, but his words stayed with me, tucked into the corners of my thoughts. He didn't call right away. I didn't expect him to. Trust takes time to settle, especially when it's newly placed. When he finally did, it was a simple check-in. "Just wanted to say I'm okay," he said. Those 3 words carried more relief than he probably realized. We met again a week later, this time in the late afternoon. Sunlight poured through the windows, bright and honest, leaving no room for shadows to hide in. It felt intentional, like we both wanted the conversation to continue in the open. He seemed steadier, still thoughtful, still careful, but not as weighed down. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work, weather, a memory from when he was younger that made us both laugh. The sound of that laughter surprised me. It felt earned. Eventually, the conversation circled back to the unspoken center. He asked how I learned to trust myself. I told him the truth, that I didn't always. That confidence wasn't something I found all at once, but something I practiced, like showing up for a daily walk even when I didn't feel like it. I shared parts of my own story I rarely spoke aloud. Moments of doubt. Times I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Choices that only made sense in hindsight. He listened the way he'd hoped I would listen to him, and that felt like a quiet exchange, equal and respectful. There was no rush, no urgency, just the steady building of understanding. I noticed how he sat more comfortably now, how his eyes didn't dart around the room. The tension that had once filled the space between us had softened into something calm. At one point, he said, "I didn't think anyone would see me this way." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged and said, "Like I'm still figuring things out, and that's okay." That might have been the most important moment of all. Not dramatic, not loud, just honest. When he left that day, I felt a quiet pride. Not in myself exactly, but in the connection we were building. It reminded me that growth doesn't always come from grand changes. Sometimes it comes from sitting across from someone, offering patience, and letting the truth breathe. I stood by the window long after he drove away, watching the light shift again, thinking about how unexpected moments can open doors inside us we didn't know were still unlocked. By the time autumn leaned fully into winter, that evening no longer felt like a secret pressing on my chest. It felt like a turning point, quiet but solid, the way a river changes course without making a sound. We didn't talk every day. We didn't need to. When we did connect, it was easy, grounded. He had started making small changes. Nothing dramatic, just honest steps in a direction that felt more like his own. Each time he shared one, I heard a little more confidence in his voice. I noticed changes in myself too. I was more patient, not just with him, but with everyone. Even with my own reflection when I caught it in the hallway mirror late at night. That promise I'd made, not to tell anyone, had taught me something about restraint and respect, about holding space without needing credit or recognition. One afternoon, months later, he stopped by again. No heaviness this time. Just a familiar knock and a smile that reached his eyes. We sat at the same table, drank the same tea I'd offered that first night. The routine felt comforting. "I don't need you to keep anything anymore," he said gently. "I just wanted you to know that." I understood what he meant. The burden had lifted, not because the story changed, but because he had. And because I have learned that being trusted is sometimes more powerful than being needed. After he left, I walked through the house slowly, noticing how full it felt. Not crowded, just lived in. I realized that the growth I'd experienced wasn't about him at all, not really. It was about remembering who I was capable of being when someone else needed steadiness instead of answers. That evening stayed with me because it reminded me that connection doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives with a soft knock, a careful question, and the courage to listen. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The moments that shape us most are often the ones we never planned to share, but are grateful we did. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give us like and subscribe this channel.